Hello, and welcome to another episode of Unworthy History. Today we got some more actual history for you from this book right here, The Adventures of Bigfoot Wallace, the Texas Ranger and Hunter by John C. Duval. This book was published all the way back in 1871. Now, this is episode 13 in my series on Bigfoot Wallace, and in the last episode, Bigfoot met the author. So here we pick up with them at Bigfoot Wallace's ranch west of San Antonio the night before they leave. After supper, as the weather was pleasant and dry, the men spread their blankets under the trees around, and soon a general snoring gave evidence that they had all emigrated to the land of Nod. "Captain," said our author to me when we were left alone in the ranch, "you have read Mr. Cooper's novels, of course. What do you think of his delineation of the Indian character?" "Yes," I replied, "Mr. Author, I have read some of his novels, and from my recollection of them, I think his Indian characters are a little too highly colored. His Indians stalk about in a lofty sort of way, wrapped up in their robes with an eagle's feather on their heads, and talk in a manner that the Indians of this country couldn't comprehend at all. Besides, his Indians, if I remember well, never laugh nor steal horses, while I have always found Indians to be uncommonly fond of a joke, especially of a certain kind, and the most arrant and expert thieves that ever went unhung. I believe they could almost steal a horse out of a corral if there had not been one in there for a week." "You astonish me greatly," said the author, "and if what you tell me about the Indians be true, I have been cruelly deceived by Mr. Cooper, and shall have an immense deal of work to do in writing over the characters of those that figure in my novel of the Wayworn Wanderer of the Western Wilds, for they are drawn after his models. I shall hate to rub out my principal hero, particularly Hopatukilikahajo, or the Rushing River, for he is my beau ideal of an aborigine, haughty and reserved, and always dressed in fringed hunting shirt, beaded moccasins, and wampum belts, and never says two words without beginning, 'Brother, listen.' Oh, it will really be too bad," he continued, "if I shall have to blot out my chef d'oeuvre, Hopatukilikahajo, after all the trouble I have had to fix him up to my notion. But I'll do it if I find his character overdrawn, for the Wayworn Wanderer is not intended for a sensation novel, and its scenes and characters must be true to nature." Our author and I sat up, I suppose, until 10 o'clock, talking on various matters. And though he was as green as a cut-seed watermelon on everything pertaining to frontier life, I found him to be well informed upon many subjects of which I was totally ignorant. I am not in the habit of putting a man up as an ignoramus merely because he is verdant in some things which my profession or peculiar mode of life has given me thorough knowledge of, and yet I know there are many men who judge of one entirely by this standard. If a man is ignorant of woodcraft, a poor shot with a rifle, and cannot manage a wild mustang, backwoodsmen are very apt to think he is no great shakes any way. After a while, our author said to me, "Captain, I am not much used to riding on horseback, especially on such horses as you have here in Texas that pitch, as you call it, half the time, like a boat beating against a head sea, and I feel a good deal worried in consequence. So if you will show me my bed, I believe I'll retire for the night." "A bed," I replied, "Mr. Author, is a piece of furniture that has never darkened the doors of this ranch yet. But there is a buffalo robe in the corner yonder, where you can lie down if you can get Tige off of it. But I see he has 9 points of the law in his favor." "Captain," said our author, after he had with some difficulty ousted Tige, "I hate to trouble you, but if there is anything in the shape of a pillow about the ranch, I should like to get it, as I cannot sleep well without something of the sort under my head." I stepped out into the yard and picked up a wooden maul, which I brought in and stuffed under his buffalo robe, telling him that there was something in the shape of a pillow, though not quite so soft as it might be, and that I hoped he would rest well, for he had a long ride before him the next day. In a little while he was sound asleep, and dreaming, I suppose, of his novel, for I heard him muttering something about the Wayworn Wanderer of the western wilds. In the morning, as soon as he awoke, he said, "Captain, this is a substantial pillow of yours here. They must last a long time." "Yes," said I, "they do, when you are careful to keep them out of the weather and don't split more than 200 rails a day with them. And how did you rest last night?" I asked. "Well, only tolerable," says he. "I've got a crick in my neck this morning, and it's no wonder, for the maul was made of ebony wood, and was hard as a flint rock. And besides, there was some sort of an insect here that bit me cruelly during the night." "Did they seem to hop, or did they appear to crawl?" I asked. "I think," he replied, "that they did more crawling than hopping, and more biting than either." "Where did you get that buckskin suit you had on?" I inquired. "From a Mexican who sold it to me as a great favor." "Then," said I guess Tige isn't to blame. Your suit is lousy for sure." "You don't say so! What am I to do, for I've nothing else here to wear but that miserable buckskin suit?" "Oh," I said, "they are all off of the clothes by this time, and on you, and if you will step down to the lake and take a good wash, you will be all right again." And away our author went, as if he had been on fire or had swallowed a dose of number 6, and he pitched head foremost into the water, where he washed, combed, and scrubbed faithfully for half an hour. All the while I knew very well that Tige was at the bottom of his troubles, but of course I didn't tell him so. After we had got some breakfast, we saddled up our horses and mounted, and took the trail of the Indians. Our author rode alongside of me on a wide-eyed paint pony, with his bird gun slung across his shoulders and his umbrella tied behind him. He didn't present a very formidable appearance, as you may well suppose, and the men were highly amused at the figure he cut, but they held in as much as possible on my account. Notwithstanding all this, as we found out afterward, our little author was as true blue as ever fluttered, though of course he couldn't do much damage with his bird gun and pepper box. I was satisfied, the Indians having had so much the start of us, that it was useless to hurry up, with the expectation of overhauling them before they reached the country they intended to occupy permanently, and I determined to travel along leisurely, and keep our horses in as good a plight as possible for the long scout that I knew was ahead of us. So we traveled only about 25 miles that day, and encamped just before sundown in a little valley, where there was a bold running creek, and plenty of good grass for our horses. When we had got some supper, we staked out our animals, placed the usual guard over them, and laid down under the trees upon our blankets, the author and I occupying one bunk together. In a little while after we had gone to roost, the author said to me, "Captain, what is that roaring I hear like a charge of cavalry?" I rose up and saw a dense black cloud coming rapidly toward us from the north, and I knew we were about to have one of those sudden squalls common at that season of the year in the hilly country, and invariably accompanied by a heavy fall of rain. "We are in for a ducking, my friend," I said, "unless you can manage to protect us with your umbrella." "I can do that," said he, jumping up, "and you will find that an umbrella is not such a bad article to have on a scout after all." So he unstrapped it from his saddle and hoisted it over us, but scarcely had he done so when the squall struck us with the force of a tornado, and the first gust of wind turned the umbrella wrong side out, wrenched it from his hand, and carried it out of sight in a moment. "Captain," he said, "what is to be done now? The umbrella has been whisked off like an old witch upon a broomstick, and we shall be drenched to the skin." "I know it," I replied, "but there's no help for it, and all we can do now is lay low and take it quietly." "Why, Captain," he answered, "it will be the death of us. I have never caught a wetting before but once in my life, and then as soon as I got home, I didn't feel safe until I was tucked into bed with the sheets aired and had swallowed a couple of hot toddies. Oh dear, the water is running down my back in a stream now. I shall certainly perish from such horrible exposure." "Not a bit of it, Mr. Author," I replied. "You'll wake up as fresh as a lark in the morning. There's a stream running down my back, too, but it isn't quite as big as the Colorado, and I'm not the least afraid of its drowning me. All you've got to do now is to keep quiet, and you will very soon be comfortable enough." "Well," said he after a while, "if this is what you call comfortable, your ideas and mine differ very widely on the subject. The water is halfway up my sides. I begin to think," he continued, shivering and scrounging up closer to me to borrow a little of my warmth, of which in fact I hadn't had much to spare. "I begin to think there is a good deal of humbug about Cooper after all, for in all his descriptions of the woods and frontier life, he never says a word about a fellow's having to sleep in a puddle on the ground, with a damp blanket smelling of horses over his shoulders, and a stream of cold water trickling down his back. When people bivouac in his novels, the nights are always serene and clear, the stars twinkle overhead, the turf is green and soft, there's a boulder as big as my fist exactly under my hip right now, and everything is pleasant and agreeable. I'm losing my confidence in Mr. Cooper quite rapidly." In about an hour the rain ceased, the puddle disappeared from around us, and notwithstanding his uncomfortable situation, our author slept like a top the balance of the night. The first thing we saw in the morning when we woke up was the umbrella on the top of a mesquite bush, where the wind had lodged it about 50 paces from where we had slept. The men discovered it about the same time, and as they wanted to fire off their guns and pistols which had got damp in the rain, they pretended to think that it was a turkey on its roost, and everyone took a crack at it. As soon as the firing ceased, our author went out and lifted it from its roost with a long pole, and though sadly damaged by the bullets and wind, he carefully strapped it on his saddle again. So that's it for this episode. Here, Bigfoot Wallace gave a critique of James Fenimore Cooper's depiction of Indians, and the author's umbrella turned out to be not very useful. So in the next episode in this series, we'll hear about some more adventures that Bigfoot Wallace had with this author. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.